Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has urged NATO to take what he called strong decisions to strengthen his country's air defenses against Russian attacks.
His appeal comes ahead of today's NATO summit in Turkiye and after Russian forces launched a massive missile and drone barrage on Monday, which targeted Kyiv and surrounding areas, killing at least 26 people. The attack comes days after another deadly Russian strike on the Ukrainian capital that claimed more than 30 lives.
Mr. Zelensky is expected to discuss the war and next steps in seeking a peace settlement when he meets U.S. President Donald Trump on the sidelines of the summit. Mr. Trump believes a resolution is closer than many people realize.
We're going to be going to NATO and we're going to be talking about it, and I think we're going to get it. I think we're going to get it ended. It's been a terrible situation.
NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte says the alliance must ensure Ukraine gets the military support it needs, including stronger air defenses. He's also demanded member states present what he calls clear, concrete and credible plans to meet defense spending targets.
I think we are in really good shape, and massively the Europeans are stepping up. Look at countries like Germany and so many others. And of course, if one or two still have to be convinced, we have ways to do that.
Defense spending will loom large over the summit as President Trump continues to press European allies to shoulder a greater burden for their collective security. And the meeting will also be closely watched for tensions over the U.S. leader's criticism of NATO for not doing enough to support America's war on Iran and ensuring the Strait of Hormuz remains open to commercial shipping. For more on what we can expect at the NATO summit today, let's speak now with Dr. Matthew Sussex. He's an associate professor in strategic studies at the Center for Future Defense and National Security at Deakin University. He's also visiting fellow of the Strategic and Defense Studies Center at the Australian National University. Thank you so much for joining us, Doctor. So as leaders gather in Ankara, what would success look like for NATO this week? Is there an outcome that President Trump, European allies and Ukraine could all walk away calling a win?
Well, look, I think that a success out of this summit will be a very clear statement by Donald Trump that the United States remains committed to the NATO alliance and remains committed to defending Europe if it needs defending, even though his main focus has been on Europe leading on its own defence. If something like that happens, then I think that will be very much a shot in the arm for the NATO alliance, for the European members who are worried about the extent of American support in Europe, and also for Ukraine as well. Whether we get that, I'm not quite sure. Donald Trump has, of course, been very, very critical of NATO, calling it a disgrace that the US is effectively backfilling European security. And the main thing that stopped the summit last year at The Hague going off the rails was a commitment by NATO members to spend up to 5% of GDP on defence. And this year, of course, that hasn't happened, in spite of the fact that European countries are spending more.
Well, Dr. Sussex, Donald Trump says he expects loyalty from NATO. So what does that mean strategically, politically? And is it also realistic to expect NATO members to respond to conflicts that are outside of the alliance's core commitments?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is another area where Donald Trump's knowledge of strategy and international security is kind of behind where he wants the NATO alliance to be. Ultimately, NATO, of course, is there to protect all its member states if there's an attack upon them. But that doesn't mean necessarily going to support the United States in wars of choice that it decides to launch. And of course, in the case of the war against Iran, many of the European NATO members didn't want the war to happen and were very reticent about getting involved because of the potential costs, not only for their own military personnel, but the ongoing costs of maintaining attempts to open the Straits of Hormuz effectively by force, against an Iranian regime that proved more than capable of being able to use drones and asymmetric tactics to really frustrate the United States' high-end military machine.
So, Doctor, if some allies refuse to fall in line on defense spending or in a broader political support, what can Mr. Trump realistically do? And what would that mean for NATO's unity?
Well, look, ultimately, he can walk away. He can say that, well, there's nothing in it now for the United States to support NATO, and ultimately the Europeans are going to have to look after their own affairs. If he does that, he still effectively has to give notice that he's withdrawing from NATO, and that takes probably about 2 years. In reality, for the US to actually do that. So more or less at the end of Trump's term. But there are other things he could do, including withdrawing more US personnel from bases in Europe, something that has already made major European partners like Germany very, very worried. Something that's also, of course, concerned those countries that are very close to Russia, like the Baltic states, like the Nordic countries, Poland and others. And if Trump decides to do that, then it would start looking as though realistically the main way for Europe to safeguard its own security is, in fact, perhaps not via NATO at all, but through its own auspices.
Yeah, Dr. Sussex, just going back to the point about the Iran war, I wonder if the US-Iran conflict has distracted NATO from its core focus of course, Russia and European security, and at the same time, whether you think there is a role that NATO can play in addressing Iran's nuclear ambitions, given that it is not directly involved in those nuclear negotiations, and whether, this Iran situation, has at all changed NATO's strategic priorities?
Yeah, look, I think the Iran war was a bit of a wild card that European countries weren't predicting, at least the European NATO members and certainly Canada as well. Has it taken their eyes off the ball? Look, I think it's something extra that they've had to deal with, and that has real effects. So for Ukraine, for instance, the thing that it needs most of all, and has certainly secured enormous amounts of EU funding to acquire, is air defence missiles. But that's something, of course, that is now very much in short supply, given that US forces and a lot of their partners in the Middle East and the Gulf states shot off a lot of their surface-to-air missiles during the Iran war. So that causes a real crunch in terms of capacity for Europe to be able to source the air defences that Ukraine needs, and has a direct result on the war. Whether NATO itself can play a role in mediating the nuclear agreement with Iran, I think yes, certainly it could. The question is whether or not Iran and the United States would be prepared to let NATO be a sort of framework actor. And typically NATO has tried to shy away from things that are outside its direct geographical remit. And if it did that, then it would open itself up to accusations that it was, basically a broad global, almost vigilante type of organisation. So there will be voices of disquiet about doing something like that. And both Tehran and Washington may prefer to continue their diplomacy through the sort of tit for tat back and forth between those two countries, because I think both perceive advantages in doing so rather than letting in a third-party mediator.
Okay, very quickly, Doctor, Russia launched one of its biggest attacks in Kyiv just hours before the summit, as President Zelensky, as you said, in the call for strong decisions from NATO leaders. What sort of message do you think Mr. Putin's trying to send here, and how might that influence outcome over military support for Ukraine at the summit?
Yeah, well, I think Putin is kind of reverting to what he normally does when there's either a big meeting or he feels as though Russia is slightly on the back foot, which certainly Ukrainian strikes against Russian oil production facilities have caused. 40 to 50% crimp in the Russian oil supply, which has caused enormous, great long lines at gas stations throughout Russia. So he's basically said, well, we are going to launch massive attacks against indiscriminate targets in Kiev. Ultimately, this is a tactic that's been tried many, many times in different conflicts, and it generally doesn't work. What it does is it hardens the resolve of those who are being struck to continue fighting, and it also hardens the resolve of those who are helping those people and those nations to keep up the supply. And we've seen some degree of also frustration with Russia from the United States, with the US putting back the sanctions on Russian oil that previously it had relaxed, and also making comments about how Ukraine is very much still in the fight. So ultimately, where the US goes with this is going to be decisive, but we're going to have to wait and see what happens in Ankara.
All right. We thank you for joining us today, Dr. Matthew Sussex, Associate Professor in Strategic Studies at the Center for Future Defense and National Security at Deakin University.